They say that time heals all wounds. They lied. Time doesn't heal, it just buries the truth under layers of dust until you're too old to dig it up. I spent 20 years believing I was the victim of a betrayal, living in the shadow of a woman who didn't exist. But today, I found her letter. And today, I realized that for 2 decades, the greatest criminal in Oakhaven wasn't running from the law, he was standing right in front of the mirror. The narrative the rain in Oakhaven was not water, it was an industrial byproduct, a greasy, soot-filled drizzle that tasted of coal and broken dreams. It hammered against the windowpane of Elias Thorne's office, a sound that had been the metronome of his miserable existence for exactly 7,304 days. Elias stood by the window, his silhouette cutting a jagged shape against the flickering neon glow of the Clockwork District sign across the street. His office was a testament to stagnation. Stacks of case files, yellowed by tobacco smoke and neglect, lined the walls like tombstones. He was not a man who lived, he was a man who endured. 20 years, Elias, he whispered to the empty room, his voice raspy from disuse. 20 years of hunting for a ghost. The eviction notice sat on his desk, an impersonal, typed sheet of paper that demanded he vacate the premises by dawn. The landlord, a man named Mr. Henderson, who possessed all the warmth of a rusted gear, had no interest in the history that had unfolded within these 4 walls. To Henderson, it was just square footage. To Elias, it was the scene of the crime, a crime committed against his own soul. As he began to pull the heavy, oak drawers from his desk to pack, his fingers caught on a strange vibration. The wood didn't sound solid, it sounded hollow. He pulled the drawer entirely out, setting it aside, and reached into the darkness of the desk cavity. His fingertips brushed against something cold and metallic, a recessed latch. With a sharp, rhythmic click, a small, hidden compartment swung open. Inside lay a tin box. It wasn't the kind of thing a private detective would hide, it was the kind of thing someone would bury to ensure it was never found. Elias pulled it out, the metal biting into his calloused palms. He sat in his chair, the leather groaning under his weight, and pried the lid open. The smell of dried lavender and old parchment wafted up, a sensory ghost that instantly transported him back to a night in autumn, 20 years prior. There, resting on a bed of velvet, was an envelope sealed with a sigil he hadn't seen in 2 lifetimes. A gear entwined with a rose. The Vane Corporation. His breath hitched. He had spent 2 decades believing that Clara Vane, the heiress to the most powerful industrial dynasty in the city, had used him as a pawn, seduced him to steal secrets, and then discarded him like a broken spring. He remembered the night she left. The way she had looked at him, with eyes that seemed to hold a secret sorrow, before she vanished into the smog of the harbor. Clara. He broke the seal. The wax crumbled like dried blood under his thumb. As he unfolded the parchment, his hands began to shake, a tremor that hadn't troubled him since he was a young, naive beat cop. "My dearest Elias," the letter began. The handwriting was elegant, loops and swirls that seemed to dance across the page. "If you are reading this, the silence has finally become too loud for you to ignore. They told you I was dead, or perhaps they told you I fled with the secrets of the forge. They lied. They didn't just lie to you, Elias, they engineered a reality for you to inhabit. They didn't kill me. They erased me. They stripped my identity, my face, my memories, and left me as nothing but a whisper in their machine." Elias felt a cold dread settle into his marrow. The Vane Corporation was the backbone of Oakhaven. They provided the power, the transport, and the very stability of the city's economy. But they were also a family known for ruthless efficiency. "You spent 20 years hating me for a betrayal I never committed," the letter continued, the ink intensifying, as if the writer's pain had bled into the page. "You thought I abandoned you for power, but I was stolen from you because I discovered the heart of the clockwork, a secret so dangerous that it would burn this city to the ground. They turned me into a weapon, Elias. I am the ghost in the machine you've been hunting. Find the one who held the key, and you will learn why I had to play the part of the traitor. You were the only one who could have survived the truth. Beneath the letter lay the brass key. It was heavy, ornate, and bore the Vane crest. It was not just an object, it was an invitation to a war he thought had ended 20 years ago. Elias looked around his office, seeing the files for what they truly were. A collection of distractions. He hadn't been an investigator, he had been a man kept in a sandbox, waiting for the truth to be unearthed. He gripped the key so hard the metal bit into his skin, drawing a thin line of red. The silence of the room was gone, replaced by the deafening sound of his own realization. He stood up, knocking the chair backward. He didn't need the files. He didn't need the city's approval. He needed to go to the Vane estate, to the very heart of the power that had dismantled his life, and he needed to break the machine. The streets of Oakhaven were not meant to be walked at night, especially not by a man carrying a secret that could collapse the city's industrial spine. Elias Thorne stepped out into the rain, the collar of his trench coat turned up against the biting wind. The air was thick with the smell of sulfur and coal smoke, the lifeblood of the Vane Corporation. He walked with a purpose he hadn't felt in 2 decades. The brass key felt like a branding iron in his pocket, a constant reminder that he was no longer just an observer of his own decay. He needed to reach the Vane estate, a sprawling Gothic fortress perched on the cliffs overlooking the dark, turbulent harbor. It was the place where Clara had lived, where she had been erased, and where the architects of his misery resided. As he bypassed the main security checkpoints, using the back alleys he had mapped out during his years as a struggling detective, the city seemed to change around him. The further he moved toward the upscale district, the cleaner the streets became, though the underlying rot remained. The shadows here were deeper, cast by street lamps that burned with a cold, unnatural blue light. He found himself standing before the massive iron gates of the estate. They were wrought into the shape of gears and clockwork mechanisms, a towering testament to the Vane family's obsession with order and time. Elias pulled the key from his pocket. It felt heavy, almost sentient. He pushed it into the hidden lock concealed within the central gear of the gate. There was no sound of tumblers clicking, instead, a low, magnetic hum resonated through the ground beneath his feet. The gates did not swing open, they retracted into the earth, disappearing with a hiss of pressurized steam. "Welcome back, Inspector," a synthesized, disembodied voice echoed from the gate pillars. Elias froze, his hand instinctively moving to the holster he hadn't carried in years. The voice didn't sound like a recording, it sounded like a memory, a distorted, melodic version of Clara's voice. He moved forward, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The gardens of the Vane estate were manicured to a level of perfection that bordered on the grotesque. Every leaf seemed aligned, every stone placed by calculation. As he crossed the threshold, he felt the heavy weight of observation. Cameras hidden within gargoyles and statues tracked his movement, their lenses glowing with the same cold, blue light as the street lamps. He reached the main foyer of the manor, a cavernous space filled with giant, ticking grandfather clocks that all, in perfect unison, struck the hour. The sound was like a hammer blow. There, standing at the top of the grand staircase, was not a servant, nor a guard, but a silhouette that chilled his blood. It was a man, tall and gaunt, dressed in a suit that looked as if it were made from the shadows themselves. "You're late, Elias," the man said, his voice smooth and devoid of humanity. 20 years late, to be precise. Elias recognized him instantly. Arthur Vane, the patriarch of the corporation, the man who had supposedly died shortly after Clara's disappearance. But here he stood, unaged, his skin pale and translucent, his eyes glowing with that same familiar, sickly blue light. "You took her," Elias growled, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "You turned her into a ghost, and you left me to rot in a life that wasn't mine." Arthur descended the stairs slowly, his movements unnervingly precise, as if he were being animated by unseen clockwork. We didn't take her, Elias. We perfected her. Clara wasn't erased, she was integrated. And as for you? You were our greatest oversight. We left you in that office because we wanted to see if the human spirit could truly be broken by the weight of its own ignorance. Elias realized then that the truth was far more terrifying than a simple betrayal. He hadn't been living in a city, he had been living in an experiment. The brass key in his pocket grew hot, vibrating against his leg. Where is she? Elias demanded, taking a step toward the stairs. Arthur smiled, a thin, cruel gesture that didn't reach his eyes. She is everywhere, Elias. She is the machine. And the only way you will ever find her is if you are willing to become a part of the mechanism yourself. Arthur Vane's words hung in the stale, clock-ticking air of the foyer, heavy with the weight of 1,000 secrets. Elias felt the floorboards beneath him, not wood, but something cold and metallic that hummed in synchronization with the clocks. He understood now that he wasn't standing in a home, he was standing inside the mainframe of Oakhaven itself. You speak in riddles, Arthur, Elias spat, his hand hovering over the heavy brass key. But I didn't come here for philosophy. I came for the woman you stole from me. Arthur didn't flinch. He continued his descent, his feet making no sound on the marble steps. You define theft by human standards, Elias. You think in terms of love and loss. But we think in terms of efficiency and continuity. Clara wasn't just a person to us. She was a bridge. Her mind had the unique capacity to process temporal data, the ability to see the gears of cause and effect before they even turned. We didn't erase her, we gave her the universe. As Arthur spoke, he waved a hand, and the wall behind him, previously a solid slab of mahogany, began to dematerialize. Behind it lay a chamber that defied logic. It was a vast, spherical space, suspended in a void. At its center hung a pulsating, luminescent core, the heart of the clockwork. It looked like a living lung made of gold, glass, and fiber optic filaments, rhythmically expanding and contracting with a soft, blue light. Elias gasped. Surrounded by this core, suspended in a web of copper wires and glowing conduits, was Clara. She looked unchanged from the day she vanished 20 years ago. Her eyes were closed, her body floating in a state of stasis. But she was not alone. Thousands of thin, glowing filaments were woven directly into her skin, pulsing with the same light that flowed from the core. She was no longer just breathing, she was calculating. She was the operating system of the entire city. She is the reason Oakhaven functions, Arthur whispered, standing beside Elias now. The traffic, the power, the economy, the very rhythm of the streets, she predicts it all. We are not just a company, Elias. We are the architects of stability. And Clara is our masterpiece. Elias felt a surge of pure, unadulterated rage. He stepped forward, his eyes locked on her peaceful, imprisoned face. She's a slave. You've turned a human soul into an algorithm. And yet, Arthur countered, his voice dripping with sinister amusement, she is the only thing keeping this city from total collapse. If you disconnect her, the lights go out. The transit systems fail. The power grid in the slums, where your precious friends live, will shatter. Oakhaven will return to the Dark Ages. Are you really prepared to sacrifice the lives of thousands for your personal vengeance? Elias looked at the brass key in his hand. He realized it wasn't just a key to a box, it was a kill switch for the heart. Clara had sent it to him because she knew he was the only one who would choose her over the city, even if the city burned for it. You underestimate her, Arthur, Elias said, his voice quiet but deadly. She didn't send me this key to save her. She sent it because she knows you've reached the limit of your control. Suddenly, the blue light of the heart flickered. Clara's eyes snapped open, not blue, but a terrifying, shifting gold. The room began to shake, The grandfather clocks in the foyer shattered simultaneously, their internal springs exploding outward like shrapnel. "She's waking up," Arthur hissed, his composure finally cracking. "Elias, don't do it!" Elias gripped the key, looking at the woman he had loved for 2 decades, the woman who had been waiting for him to finish the investigation she had started from the inside. The world didn't just break, it fractured into a million jagged pieces of data. As Clara's eyes shifted to that burning, liquid gold, the very architecture of the Vane estate began to tear itself apart. Walls of solid mahogany dissolved into streams of binary code, and the screams of twisting metal filled the air like the wails of a dying god. Elias was thrown backward, the force of the energy surge slamming him against a pillar that was rapidly shifting from marble to shifting liquid shadow. He clutched a brass key to his chest, his knuckles white. This wasn't just a mechanical failure, it was a digital insurrection. Clara was purging the system. "You have no idea what you've unleashed!" Arthur screamed, his voice distorting, fluctuating between human and the harsh, screeching static of a radio frequency. He lunged at Elias, but his movements were stuttering, like a video playing at the wrong frame rate. He was losing his grip on the physical plane. Elias rolled aside, narrowly dodging Arthur's frantic swipe. He didn't fight back, he fought forward. He scrambled toward the central core, his eyes locked on the console beneath the heart of the clockwork. "Clara?" he shouted, his voice cracking. "I'm here. Tell me what to do." The room erupted in a blinding flash of white light. When Elias regained his vision, the atmosphere had shifted. The cold, sterile blue of the Vane Corporation was being consumed by a warm, chaotic violet hue. Clara was no longer floating in silence, her body was convulsing, her hands pressed against the glass of the stasis field as if she were trying to shatter it from the inside. A voice resonated directly inside Elias's mind, not spoken, but felt, like an electric shock to his nerves. "Elias. The key. The lock isn't on the outside. It's in the sink." He looked at the brass key. The emblem of the gear and rose was now glowing with a rhythmic, pulsing light that matched Clara's heartbeat. He realized the key wasn't a weapon to destroy the heart, it was a bridge to pull her back out of it. If he inserted it into the console, he wouldn't just be stopping the machine, he would be inviting her consciousness into the physical world, but doing so would collapse the entire grid that Oakhaven relied upon. "If I do this," Elias yelled toward the pulsating core, "the city falls. Everything goes dark. Oakhaven is already dead." "Elias," Clara's voice echoed in his mind, desperate and sharp. "They've been burning it from the inside for years. Set it free." Arthur appeared behind him, his face a mask of static-filled rage. He raised a hand, and the very air around him solidified into blades of dark energy. "Don't you dare! If you disconnect her, the chaos will kill us all." Elias looked at the city outside the shattering windows, a sprawling, dark, industrial nightmare that had kept him prisoner for 20 years. He looked at Clara, his hand trembling as he reached for the slot in the console. He was a detective, he had spent his life searching for the truth. And the truth was that he would rather live in a world that was broken and free than in a perfect cage built by a monster. He slammed the brass key into the console and twisted. The sound was not an explosion, but a long, agonizing sigh of a machine being put to rest. The blue lights died across the entire horizon. Oakhaven plunged into absolute, terrified darkness. The darkness that swallowed Oakhaven was not the gentle dark of a quiet night, it was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. For the first time in decades, the eternal hum of the city's industrial veins had stopped. The silence was so profound it felt like a physical weight, broken only by the ragged, desperate breathing of the two people standing in the wreckage of the Vane estate. Elias slumped against the shattered console, his lungs burning as he pulled in air that no longer tasted of ozone and machine oil. Beside him, Clara had collapsed onto the cold floor. She was shivering, wrapped in the thin, synthetic remains of her stasis suit. She was human again, fragile and shivering in the sudden, biting cold of a city stripped of its artificial warmth. "You did it," she whispered, her voice raw, as if she hadn't used her vocal cords in a lifetime. Elias reached out, his hand hovering before gently touching her shoulder. She was real. She was warm. But as he looked out into the void where Oakhaven used to be, he saw the first flickers of distant fires. The blackout had not brought peace, it had brought the immediate, violent collapse of order. In the slums, where the power grid had been the only thing keeping the freezing temperatures and the desperate at bay, the panic had already begun. "We didn't just turn off the lights, Clara," Elias said, pulling her to her feet. "We stopped the world. They're going to be coming for us. Everyone who relied on that grid, everyone who served the Vane family." "Let them come," Clara replied, her eyes catching the faint, natural moonlight filtering through the shattered roof. The golden glow was gone, replaced by a steely, sharp intelligence. She had spent 20 years processing every transaction, every secret, and every movement within the city. She knew the location of every hidden vault, every corrupt official, and every buried lie. She wasn't just a victim anymore, she was the architect's greatest threat. As they navigated the ruins of the manor, they heard the rhythmic, heavy thud of tactical boots approaching from the main hall. Arthur's private security detail, men who were more machine than human, had survived the surge. They were hunting in the dark, their infrared optics undoubtedly scanning the room. "Stay behind me," Elias commanded, drawing a heavy, metallic service pistol he had reclaimed from the debris. They moved like shadows through the wreckage. Elias knew every inch of the estate's layout, not from his time as a detective, but from the maps Clara was projecting directly into his mind. It was a strange, invasive sensation, but he trusted her implicitly. She guided his hand, her instincts sharpening his reflexes, turning him from a broken, middle-aged man into a ghost of the law he once was. They reached the service tunnels beneath the estate. This was the city's forgotten circulatory system, a labyrinth of pipes and vents that led straight into the heart of the lower districts. As they descended, Clara looked back at the dying heart of the clockwork. "They will try to reboot it, Elias," she said, her voice grim. "The Vane family isn't just Arthur. It's an entire board of directors, an entire philosophy of control. If we don't destroy the backup servers in the industrial sector, the darkness will only last for an hour before the nightmare starts all over again." Elias looked at her, seeing the woman he had spent 20 years searching for. The mission had changed. It wasn't about the past anymore. It was about ensuring that the future belonged to the people of Oakhaven, not to the gears that had ground them down. "Then we destroyed the source," Elias said. Together. The service tunnels were a suffocating maze of rusted steel and leaking steam pipes, a forgotten vein of the city that pulsed with the sound of distant, grinding machinery. Elias moved with a fluidity that surprised him. It was as if Clara's knowledge of the city's layout had overwritten his own muscle memory. Every turn was calculated, every shadow utilized to hide their movement from the security drones that were now buzzing through the upper levels of the city like angry hornets. "The backup server is housed within the ironworks," Clara whispered, her voice echoing faintly against the wet tunnel walls. "It's a redundant system, independent of the heart, designed to restart the grid from the ground up if the main node fails. If they activate it, they'll lock the city down for another century." "How do we stop it?" Elias asked, checking the magazine of his weapon. They had reached an intersection where the air grew thick with heat, the breath of the massive furnaces above. Clara placed her hand against a wall of vibrating conduit. "I have to interface with it directly. But I can't do it while they are tracking my signature. You need to create a distraction, Elias. Something loud enough to draw every drone and guard in the sector toward the blast furnace." Elias looked at the man he had been just hours ago, the tired detective who had accepted a life of misery, and realized that man had died the moment he held that brass key. "I'll draw them," he said, his voice steady. You just make sure those servers never turn on again. They emerged from the tunnels into the belly of the ironworks. It was a cathedral of industry, filled with massive, roaring furnaces and conveyor belts that stretched into the darkness like the spines of prehistoric beasts. The light here was orange and malevolent, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to claw at the walls. As soon as they stepped onto the main floor, the sirens began, a piercing, mechanical wail that signaled they had been detected. Go! Elias shouted, shoving Clara toward the control center. He sprinted toward the main pressure valves of the blast furnace, bullets sparking against the metal around him as drones descended from the rafters. He wasn't playing detective anymore, he was a whirlwind of calculated violence. He slammed his shoulder into the manual release, forcing the safety locks to disengage. The furnace groaned, a sound of tortured metal, as the pressure began to spike. Across the hall, he saw Clara reaching the central console. She looked like a ghost bathed in firelight, her fingers dancing across the interface as she began the process of purging the backup protocols. Arthur's voice boomed over the speakers, distorted and furious. You are destroying the only order the city has ever known, Thorn. Without us, there is only madness. Madness is better than slavery. Elias roared back, firing his weapon into the cooling fans of the nearest server rack. The machine shrieked as its circuits began to melt. The ironworks began to tremble. The pressure in the furnace had reached critical levels, and the structural integrity of the sector was failing. Elias saw Clara look up, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and triumph as the final sequence executed. The backup servers began to darken, their lights blinking out one by one like dying stars. Elias, move! Clara screamed, sprinting toward him through the chaos. He turned to run, but a heavy blast of concussion force from the furnace caught him, sending him tumbling toward the edge of the molten pit. The world tilted, the roar of the fire becoming the only thing he could hear. As he reached out, a hand grabbed his, firm, warm, and human. Clara pulled him back from the precipice just as the ceiling above them collapsed, burying the machinery of the Vane Corporation under tons of twisted steel and burning debris. They stood in the sudden, eerie silence of the ruined hall, the heart of the city's control finally silenced. The air was heavy with dust, but for the first time in 20 years, the hum of the machine was gone. Oakhaven was truly, dangerously silent. And for the first time, Elias Thorne didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He looked at Clara, who was covered in soot, her breath coming in shallow gasps. It's done, she whispered. No, Elias replied, looking up at the sky where the first hints of dawn were breaking through the smog. It's just beginning. The silence that followed the collapse of the ironworks was not the empty silence of a grave, but the expectant quiet of a blank page. Elias and Clara stood amidst the smoking ruins of the city's heart, watching as the black, impenetrable smog that had choked Oakhaven for 2 decades began to thin, revealing a sky not of ash, but of bruised indigo. For the first time, there was no hum. No electric surveillance. No whispered instructions from the heart of the clockwork. The city was finally, terrifyingly, human. They'll come for us, Clara said, her voice soft but steady. She was leaning against a shattered support beam, her clothes torn and stained with the grime of the tunnels, yet she looked more alive than the day he had first met her. The board, the shareholders, the survivors of the Vane regime. They aren't going to let their world go quietly. Elias holstered his weapon. The weight of it, once a comfort, now felt like an artifact of a life he had left behind in the rubble. He looked at his hands, calloused, trembling, but free. Let them come. We aren't hunting ghosts anymore. We're standing in the light. As they emerged from the ironworks into the streets of Oakhaven, the scene was one of chaos, but also of dawning wonder. People were stepping out of their cramped, dark apartments, their faces lit by the glow of small, handheld fires, not the cold blue light of the grid. Some were weeping, others were shouting in confusion, but all of them were looking up. For the first time in their lives, they could see the stars, distant, indifferent, and beautiful. Clara took Elias's hand. Her grip was firm. We broke the cage, Elias. But we didn't build the world outside of it. The people are scared. They don't know who they are without the machine to tell them. Then we show them, Elias said, looking down the street where the city's populace was beginning to gather. We aren't detectives or architects. We're just two people who survived a lie. That's enough to start with. He knew the path ahead would be fraught with retribution. Arthur Vane's ghost would haunt the halls of power for a long time, and the transition from a machine-run nightmare to a free society would be brutal. But as he looked at the horizon, where the sun was finally beginning to pierce through the remaining clouds, he felt a lightness he hadn't known in 20 years. He had spent 2 decades looking for Clara, fueled by the cold fire of vengeance. He had found her, and in doing so, he had found that the only thing worth fighting for wasn't the past, but the uncertainty of the future. Clara turned to him, a faint, genuine smile touching her lips, an expression he had only ever seen in his dreams. Where do we go from here, Elias? Elias looked at the city, then back at her. Nowhere in particular. For the first time in 20 years, we don't have a schedule. We don't have a machine counting down our seconds. They began to walk, disappearing into the waking crowd, 2 figures among thousands, leaving behind the legend of the detective and the ghost. Oakhaven would change, and they would be the ones to help forge it, not as pawns, but as architects of their own destiny. The story of the clockwork silence had ended, but the story of the living had just begun.